The pristine marble floor of Manhattan's most exclusive employment agency bore the scuff marks of 15 different pairs of designer shoes, all belonging to candidates who had literally run away from the same job interview. The brass elevator. Doors slid open with a soft whisper, and out stepped another victim of Jasper Blackwood's legendary cruelty, a Harvard-educated landscape architect, clutching his portfolio like a shield, his face pale as fresh snow. He asked me if I knew the difference between a rose and my own incompetence. The man stammered to the receptionist before practically sprinting toward the exit. Then he had security escort me out when I couldn't answer. Margaret Sterling, the silver-haired queen of impossible placements, watched from her corner office as Manhattan's finest gardening experts continued their parade of defeat. Her mahogany desk displayed a single file that had become her personal Everest. Jasper Blackwood, a state gardener needed. $200,000 annually, hazard pay included. Jasper Blackwood. Even his name sounded like a warning. The 32-year-old tech mogul had revolutionized artificial intelligence before most people his age had figured out their career paths. His company, Blackwood Industries, predicted everything from stock crashes to weather patterns with supernatural accuracy. The irony? He couldn't predict that treating employees like disposable tissues might be bad for business. The man was gorgeous in that dangerous, untouchable way that romance novels promised and real life rarely delivered. 6'3" of lean, muscle-wrapped in custom Italian suits, with jet black hair that looked like he'd just run his fingers through it in frustration, and piercing green eyes that could freeze hell itself. But his beauty came with a price tag, a temperament that made hurricanes look like gentle breezes. Just as Margaret contemplated early retirement, the elevator chimed again. This time, it revealed someone completely unexpected. Bella Martinez stepped into the marble cathedral of corporate success, looking like she'd wandered in from a completely different universe. Her wild, chocolate-brown curls refused to be tamed by the cheap drugstore hair tie she'd used, escaping in rebellious spirals that caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her amber eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that suggested she found life amusing even when it was trying to knock her down. She wore a thrift store blazer that was 2 sizes too big, paired with jeans that had been patched so many times they told the story of her struggles, and boots that had walked 1,000 miles but still had a few thousand left in them. "I'm here about the gardening position," Bella announced, her voice carrying the melodic hint of her Puerto Rican grandmother's accent, the woman who had taught her that flowers could bloom in concrete if they were stubborn enough. Margaret's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "You mean the Blackwood estate position? That's the one." Bella's grin was so bright it could have powered the building's lighting system. The job that apparently makes grown men question their life choices and sends landscape architects into witness protection. The older woman leaned forward, studying this fascinating creature who seemed immune to the terror that had claimed 15 previous candidates. "My dear, are you quite certain? Perhaps something at Central Park? Lovely atmosphere, reasonable supervision, bosses who don't make Harvard graduates cry." Bella's laugh bubbled up like champagne, filling the sterile office with unexpected warmth. "Mrs. Sterling, I've been unemployed for 4 months. My checking account has fewer zeros than a kindergarten math book. I'm living on ramen noodles and expired hope, and my landlord is about as patient as a hungry shark. I'm not exactly in a position to be intimidated by some overgrown rich boy with a plant obsession." Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. In 30 years of placing domestic staff with the impossible elite, no one had ever described Jasper Blackwood as an overgrown rich boy. Terrifying, yes. Devastating? Absolutely. But never quite so dismissively human. "Have you researched him at all?" Margaret felt morally obligated to ask, though her desperation to fill this position warred with her conscience. "Oh, I did my homework," Bella replied, settling into the plush leather chair like she owned it. Jasper Blackwood, tech genius, made his first billion by age 28, lives alone in a mansion that could house a small village, and apparently has the people skills of a rabid porcupine. She paused, her eyes twinkling with dangerous confidence. But here's what I learned from growing up with 3 older brothers, who thought they were tougher than they actually were. Bullies are usually just scared little kids wearing expensive masks. Margaret stared at this remarkable young woman who seemed to view New York's most feared bachelor as nothing more than a challenging behavioral puzzle. Either Bella Martinez was extraordinarily brave, completely delusional, or possessed. Some magical quality that Margaret couldn't identify. Possibly all 3. Besides, Bella continued, pulling a worn leather notebook from her oversized purse, I've been gardening since I could walk. My abuela taught me that plants respond to love, not fear. If this Jasper character has been terrorizing gardeners, maybe that's why his precious flowers are dying. Sometimes what looks like cruelty is just someone who's forgotten how to ask for help nicely. 30 minutes later, Bella emerged from the building with a signed contract worth more money than she'd seen in her entire life, detailed instructions for Monday morning, and strict warnings about Jasper's temperament that she'd cheerfully ignored. As she actually skipped toward the subway, Margaret made a note in her calendar: follow up in 48 hours. If Bella survives, study her methods. If she doesn't, arrange flowers for the funeral. Meanwhile, high above the city in his glass tower that scraped the clouds, Jasper Blackwood stood in his corner office, staring at the security monitors displaying his estate's gardens. His prize-winning roses, the only living things he'd ever successfully cared for, withering despite the attention of countless expensive experts. Their slow death felt like a metaphor for everything he touched. He didn't know that in less than 72 hours, a whirlwind in thrift store clothes would crash into his perfectly ordered world and teach him that sometimes the best things in life came in the most unexpected packages. The collision between his world of isolated perfection and her universe of stubborn hope was about to create the most beautiful chaos either of them had ever experienced. Monday morning arrived like a reluctant actor taking the stage. Gray clouds hanging over the Hudson Valley like a theatrical backdrop designed to intimidate. Bella Martinez stood at the wrought iron gates of the Blackwood estate, her beat-up Honda Civic looking like a lost tourist next to the Bentleys and Maseratis that occasionally glided past on the tree-lined private road. The estate stretched before her like something torn from the pages of Architectural Digest and sprinkled with fairy tale magic. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of modern Gothic architecture, all sharp angles and soaring glass, as if someone had taken a medieval castle and dragged it kicking and screaming into the 21st century. But it was the gardens that made Bella's breath catch in her throat. Even in their current state of elegant decline, she could see the bones of something extraordinary. Formal rose gardens that had once rivaled Versailles now looked like beautiful women who'd forgotten how to smile. Ancient oak trees stood sentinel over pathways that meandered through what should have been a paradise, but felt more like a museum where no one was allowed to touch the exhibits. "You must be the latest sacrifice," came a dry voice from behind her. Bella spun around to find a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen everything twice. She wore the kind of crisp uniform that suggested authority and carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd been running things long before anyone thought to question her methods. "I'm Bella Martinez, the new gardener," Bella replied, extending her hand with a grin that could have melted glaciers. "And you must be the person who's going to tell me all the juicy details about my new boss's dramatic tendencies." The woman's stern expression cracked like ice in spring sunshine. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, head housekeeper. And if you're here to collect gossip, you'll be disappointed. If you're here to actually garden," she gestured toward the estate with something that might have been hope, Well, you'll be the first one who's tried. They walked through gardens that told the story of Jasper's isolation better than any biography could. Everything was technically perfect, not a leaf out of place. Every hedge trimmed to mathematical precision, but it felt lifeless, like a beautiful corpse dressed up for viewing. He designs it all himself, Mrs. Whitmore explained as they passed a fountain that looked lonely despite its grandeur. Every pathway, every plant placement, every bench positioned for optimal viewing angles. The previous gardeners were basically highly paid maintenance staff. He'd fire them the moment they suggested any changes. What about the roses? Bella asked, stopping beside what had once been a spectacular rose garden. The bushes were still there, but their blooms were sparse and lackluster, like performers who'd forgotten their lines. His obsession, Mrs. Whitmore's voice softened slightly. He's been trying to perfect a new hybrid. For 3 years. Something about creating beauty that couldn't disappoint him. She paused, then added quietly, I think they're dying because they can feel his frustration. Before Bella could respond, the sound of expensive shoes on gravel announced the arrival of the man himself. Jasper Blackwood emerged from the mansion like storm clouds given human form, and Bella's first thought was that photographs had not done him justice. They had done him a disservice by failing to capture the raw intensity that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of lean strength that came from expensive personal trainers and the genetic lottery. His black hair looked like he'd been running his fingers through it in frustration, which, given his reputation, was probably accurate. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Green as emeralds and twice as hard, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, but he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, as if even his expensive armor couldn't contain whatever restless energy drove him. You're late, were his first words, delivered in a voice that could have been used to negotiate international treaties or seduce heads of state, depending on his mood. Bella glanced at her phone. It's 6:58 a.m. You said 7 o'clock. I said 7 o'clock sharp. Sharp implies precisely on time, not wandering around admiring the architecture. His tone could have frozen champagne. Any normal person would have apologized, cowered, or made excuses. Bella Martinez was not normal people. You're right, she said cheerfully, pulling a small notebook from her pocket. I was 2 minutes early, which technically makes me early, not late. But I can see punctuality is important to you, so I'll make a note. Boss has interesting relationship with time and basic mathematics. Mrs. Whitmore made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a suppressed laugh. In 30 years of working for Jasper, she'd never heard anyone speak to him like that and lived to tell about it. Jasper stared at Bella as if she'd just announced she was from Mars and had come to redecorate his planet. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a very attractive fish encountering an entirely new species. Did you just take notes about me? He asked, his voice climbing half an octave in disbelief. Field research, Bella replied brightly. If I'm going to work with someone who fires gardeners faster than most people change socks, I figure I should document the warning signs. You know, for science. For a moment, the only sound was the fountain's lonely babbling and what might have been Mrs. Whitmore trying not to giggle. Jasper looked like someone had just rearranged his entire understanding of the universe using kindergarten blocks. Most people find me intimidating, he said finally, as if testing whether this strange creature in front of him was actually human. Most people haven't raised 3 older brothers who thought they invented intimidation. Bella shot back. You're tall, rich, and grumpy. They were tall, broke, and grumpy. The only difference is better tailoring. Mrs. Whitmore had given up all pretense of discretion and was now openly grinning. Jasper ran a hand through his hair, confirming Bella's theory about the source of its dishevelment, and seemed to be having an internal argument with himself. Finally, He gestured toward the rose garden with the air of a general pointing toward a particularly challenging battlefield. "Fine, show me what you can do with those." As they walked toward the roses, Bella felt a little thrill of victory. Round one to the girl from the Bronx who'd learned that the best way to handle a charging bull was to step aside and let it run into a wall. What she didn't notice was the way Jasper kept glancing at her when he thought she wasn't looking, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more interesting than his spreadsheets. The battle for the Blackwood Garden and Hearts had officially begun. 3 hours later, Jasper Blackwood stood at his floor-to-ceiling office window like a brooding hero from a Jane Austen adaptation, pretending to review merger documents, while actually watching the most entertaining gardening performance Broadway had never produced. Below in his meticulously manicured rose garden, Bella Martinez had transformed into what could only be described as Snow White's rebellious cousin, who'd skipped the singing animals in favor of therapeutic plant conversations. She'd changed into work clothes that should have rendered her completely invisible to his executive sensibilities, ripped jeans that looked like they'd survived several natural disasters, a faded metallic t-shirt that had clearly been through more wash cycles than most marriages, and boots that appeared to have been constructed from pure stubbornness and duct tape. Yet somehow, watching her move through his garden with the fluid grace of a prima ballerina who decided to take up extreme gardening, Jasper found his quarterly profit reports about as interesting as watching paint dry in slow motion. The woman was conducting a full-scale Dr. Phil intervention with his roses. "Okay, listen up, gorgeous," she announced to a particularly melodramatic hybrid tea rose, crouching down to examine its drooping petals with the intensity of Sherlock Holmes investigating a murder scene. "I can see you're going through some things, and that's totally valid. But this whole wilting dramatically for attention routine, we need to talk about healthier coping mechanisms." Jasper's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. In his 32 years of existence, he'd never heard anyone conduct relationship counseling with landscaping. His 12 previous gardening experts had approached his roses like scientists studying specimens under laboratory conditions. This woman was treating them like patients in group therapy. "Sir?" His assistant Marcus materialized in the doorway with the stealth of a well-trained ninja, tablet clutched to his chest like a shield against his boss's increasingly unpredictable behavior. "Your 10 o'clock appointment with the Hartwell Industries executives is here. You know, the merger that's worth approximately the GDP of a small European country?" "Cancel it," Jasper replied without turning from his front row seat to the Bella Martinez show. Marcus's tablet nearly slipped from his grasp. "Sir, with all due respect, this merger has been in development for 8 months. The lawyers alone have billed enough hours to fund a space program." "I said cancel it." Jasper's tone carried the kind of finality usually reserved for declaring wars or ending relationships. Below, Bella had moved on to what appeared to be a rousing motivational speech delivered to his prize-winning climbing roses. Marcus retreated with the expression of someone mentally updating his resume, muttering something about early retirement and stress-induced baldness. Down in the garden, Bella had produced an impressive collection of tools from what looked like Mary Poppins' magical carpet bag, except instead of hat stands and floor lamps, she was pulling out instruments that appeared to have been handed down through generations of plant whisperers. She worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, but with a joy that seemed to radiate outward like she was starring in her own personal music video. "Found the problem," she exclaimed triumphantly, holding up a handful of soil like she'd just discovered buried treasure. "You poor babies have been drowning in good intentions and choking on expensive care. Classic case of helicopter parenting gone wrong." Jasper nearly choked on his coffee. Helicopter parenting? She was psychoanalyzing his gardening techniques through agricultural metaphors. "Don't worry, beautiful ones," she continued. addressing the entire garden like a general rallying demoralized troops before the final battle. Abuela always said plants are like people. They don't need perfect conditions. They need understanding. And you've been loved like museum pieces instead of living things. Those words hit Jasper with the emotional equivalent of a freight train, carrying truth bombs. Loved like museum pieces instead of living things. He thought about Victoria, his ex-fiancée, who'd walked away 18 months ago with the devastating observation that being with him was like dating a beautiful statue that occasionally bought expensive gifts. He thought about every relationship that had withered under his need for control, every friendship that had suffocated under his impossibly high standards. His phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts from Marcus, Hartwell executives asking, "If you've been kidnapped by corporate rivals, and should I fake a family emergency or just claim alien abduction?" Jasper ignored them all, mesmerized by the transformation happening below. Bella worked with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, but also with a playfulness that turned gardening into performance art. She hummed snippets of songs that ranged from classic rock to what sounded like Puerto Rican folk tunes, occasionally breaking into animated negotiations with particularly stubborn weeds. "Excuse me, Mr. Dandelion," she announced to one particularly audacious intruder, hands on her hips in a pose that somehow managed to be both authoritative and adorable. "I admire your confidence, I really do, but this is a rose garden, not a free-for-all democracy. You're going to have to relocate to somewhere more suited to your entrepreneurial spirit." Jasper found himself almost smiling, an expression so foreign to his features that he actually touched his face to make sure he wasn't having some kind of facial malfunction. Around noon, Mrs. Whitmore appeared with a lunch tray, and Jasper watched the two women settle on a garden bench like characters from a heartwarming indie film. Their laughter floated up to his window, genuine and warm in a way that made something in his chest loosen for the first time in months. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? When was the last time he'd laughed at all without it being a calculated social response? His intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Blackwood? Miss Martinez is requesting an audience. With your royal grumpiness." Marcus had clearly abandoned all pretense of professional formality. "Send her up," Jasper replied, his pulse doing something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. 5 minutes later, Bella knocked on his door carrying a small potted plant and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement that made her amber eyes sparkle like champagne in candlelight. She'd somehow managed to acquire an impressive collection of dirt smudges, grass stains, and what looked like a small twig in her hair, but she wore her gardening battle scars like designer accessories. "I've solved the mystery of your moody roses," she announced, setting the pot on his pristine mahogany desk with the confidence of someone presenting evidence that would revolutionize botanical science. "Your previous experts were treating symptoms instead of the actual problem. In 3 hours?" Jasper's voice came out rougher than intended, like he'd been gargling gravel mixed with disbelief. "My last team of experts spent 6 weeks and produced a 40-page report that read like a dissertation on advanced plant psychology." "That's because they were overthinking it," Bella replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk without invitation, as if she'd been claiming territory in Billionaire offices her entire life. "They were trying to solve your roses like a mathematical equation instead of listening to what they actually needed." She gestured to the small plant she'd brought, which looked like evidence from a horticultural crime scene. "See these roots? All pale and tangled like they're having an anxiety attack? That's not disease, Mr. Blackwood. That's stress. Your roses aren't dying from neglect, they're suffocating from perfectionism." The words hung in the air between them like a diagnosis that extended far beyond gardening. Jasper felt like she'd just performed a psychological evaluation on his entire existence using his landscaping as supporting evidence. "Plants respond to emotional energy," Bella continued, her hands moving expressively as she spoke, painting pictures in the air with her enthusiasm. Your garden is technically flawless, but it feels like a photo shoot instead of a home. Everything's so controlled, so rigidly managed, that your roses are spending all their energy trying to meet impossible standards instead of just being beautiful. Jasper realized he'd stopped breathing. This woman had just described his entire approach to life using roses as a metaphor, and the accuracy was terrifying. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a vulnerability he hadn't intended to reveal. Bella's smile could have powered the entire Hudson Valley electrical grid. "Let me show them how to be gorgeous without being perfect. Give me creative freedom to make real changes, not just maintenance, but actual transformation. And maybe..." She paused, studying his face with those perceptive amber eyes that seemed to see past all his carefully constructed defenses. "Maybe spend some time in the garden yourself. Plants grow better when they feel appreciated instead of just monitored." Jasper found himself staring at her mouth as she spoke, watching the way her lips curved around words like they were creating small pieces of poetry. This was dangerous territory. He didn't do impulsive decisions or trust people he'd known for less than 4 hours. His entire empire had been built on careful analysis, strategic planning, and never letting emotions override logic. But something about this woman made him want to throw his rulebook out the window and see what happened when he stopped trying to control every variable. "You have 2 weeks, he heard himself say, as if someone else was operating his vocal cords. "Prove your theory. Deal." Bella grinned, extending her dirt-stained hand across his pristine desk. When their skin touched, Jasper felt something electric pass between them, a spark that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the way she looked at him, like she could see the person he might be if he stopped being afraid of imperfection. As she bounced out of his office, chattering excitedly about companion planting and letting the roses learn to breathe again, Jasper realized he'd just handed creative control of his sanctuary to a complete stranger who talked to plants like they were therapy patients. The logical part of his brain was conducting a full-scale panic attack, but for the first time in years, he found himself actually excited about tomorrow. Outside his window, the roses already seemed to be standing a little straighter, as if they too were anticipating the beautiful chaos about to transform their perfectly ordered world. In the distance, he could hear Bella's voice carrying on the afternoon breeze. "Don't worry, beautiful ones. We're going to teach you how to be wild." Again, Jasper smiled. Actually smiled, and for once didn't question the unfamiliar expression on his face. 1 week into what Mrs. Whitmore had dubbed the Great Garden Revolution, Jasper Blackwood's perfectly ordered world looked like it had been hit by a hurricane named Bella Martinez, and he was beginning to suspect he might actually enjoy natural disasters. His morning routine, which had been as precisely choreographed as a Swiss watch for the past decade, now included an inexplicable detour past the kitchen window that offered the best view of his gardens. This morning, like every morning this week, he found himself clutching his coffee mug and staring at the transformation happening outside, like a suburban dad watching his teenager redecorate their room with spray paint and questionable judgment. The changes were ... significant. Gone were the rigid geometric patterns that had made his rose garden look like something designed by a mathematician with obsessive-compulsive disorder. In their place, Bella had created flowing, organic curves that seemed to dance across the landscape like frozen music. She'd introduced wildflowers that his previous gardeners would have considered horticultural heresy, cheerful daisies nestled between aristocratic roses, rebellious sunflowers towering over dignified tea roses like friendly giants at a formal dinner party. But it was more than just the physical changes. The entire garden felt different, like it had finally learned how to breathe after holding its breath for years. "Sir?" Marcus appeared beside him, tablet in hand and expression carefully neutral. "You've been standing here for 23 minutes. Should I reschedule your morning conference call? Or are we conducting business via interpretive garden gazing now? Jasper didn't respond immediately, mesmerized by the sight of Bella emerging from behind a newly planted trellis covered in morning glories. She wore cut-off denim shorts that had clearly been customized by years of hard work rather than expensive designers, a tank top the color of summer sky, and work boots that looked like they'd hiked through several different ecosystems. Her wild curls were barely contained by a bandana that made her look like a glamorous pirate who decided to pursue horticulture instead of treasure hunting. She was singing something in Spanish while wrestling with what appeared to be a particularly stubborn climbing rose, and even from his second-floor perch, Jasper could see the joy radiating from her like sunshine. When was the last time he'd approached any task with that kind of pure, unfiltered enthusiasm? "Sir?" Marcus tried again, this time with the carefully modulated tone he used when he suspected his boss might be having some kind of executive breakdown. "Cancel the call," Jasper said absently, watching Bella successfully negotiate a peace treaty between the climbing rose and a wooden trellis. "Sir, that's the third conference call you've canceled this week. The board is starting to ask questions. Yesterday, Mr. Henderson used the phrase concerning behavioral patterns in an email." Jasper finally turned away from the window, though it required significantly more willpower than he cared to admit. "What kind of questions?" Marcus consulted his tablet with the expression of someone delivering potentially explosive news. "Well, there's speculation ranging from midlife crisis to secret government recruitment to alien possession. Jennifer from accounting started a betting pool." "What are the odds on alien possession?" "Surprisingly high, actually. Your recent gardening obsession has been noted and documented." Before Jasper could respond to this disturbing intelligence report, his office door burst open without the courtesy of a knock. Bella Martinez stormed in like a force of nature, wearing dirt-stained denim and carrying what appeared to be a small shrub that had seen better days. "We need to talk," she announced, setting the plant on his desk with the dramatic flair of someone presenting evidence in a murder trial. "Your roses are staging a rebellion, and I think I know why." Marcus retreated toward the door with the survival instincts of someone who'd learned to recognize incoming storms. "I'll just have to cancel some more meetings. And maybe update my resume." Jasper found himself staring at Bella, who somehow managed to make agricultural crisis management look like high fashion. Her cheeks were flushed from work and sunshine. Her amber eyes sparked with frustrated determination, and she had a small smudge of soil on her nose that he found ridiculously endearing. "A rebellion?" he managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Look at this poor thing," Bella said, gesturing to the sad shrub she'd brought as evidence. "This is from your prize hybrid section, the roses you care about most. They're beautiful, technically perfect, absolutely flawless, and completely miserable." She perched on the edge of his desk like she owned it, bringing her close enough that he could catch hints of her scent: sunshine, earth, and something that might have been vanilla. "I've been watching them for a week, and I finally figured out the problem. They're performing instead of growing." "Performing?" "They're so busy trying to be the perfect roses you expect them to be that they've forgotten how to just be roses," Bella explained, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. "It's like, imagine if you spent your entire life trying to be the perfect son, the perfect student, the perfect businessman, but you never got to figure out who you actually are underneath all those expectations." Jasper felt like she'd just performed surgery on his soul, using garden metaphors as scalpels. The accuracy was terrifying and oddly liberating at the same time. "What do you suggest?" he asked quietly. Bella's smile could have powered the entire estate's electrical grid. "I want to try an experiment. What if we let them be imperfect? What if we encourage them to grow wild and see what happens when they stop trying to meet impossible standards?" "That sounds like chaos." "That sounds like freedom," she countered, her eyes sparkling with the kind of mischief that probably got her into trouble on a regular basis. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? They stay exactly as unhappy as they are now." Jasper realized she was right, and the realization was more unsettling than her proximity, which was saying something. His entire life had been built on control, precision, and meeting impossibly high standards. The idea of deliberately encouraging imperfection went against every instinct he developed since childhood. But looking at this woman who seemed to find joy in dirt and possibility in problems, he found himself wanting to see what would happen if he stopped trying to control every variable. "How long would this experiment take?" he heard himself ask. "The rest of our 2 weeks," Bella replied. "But I have one condition, which is, you have to help me." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge wrapped in an invitation. Jasper stared at her, this force of nature who'd turned his orderly world upside down in the span of a week, and realized she wasn't just talking about gardening. "I don't know anything about gardening," he said, though they both knew that wasn't really what she was asking. "I'll teach you," Bella grinned, extending her dirt-stained hand across his pristine desk. "Partners?" When their skin touched this time, Jasper felt that same electric spark, but stronger now, like recognition. As if some part of him that had been dormant for years was finally waking up and stretching toward the light. "Partners," he agreed. And for the first time in his adult life, he made a decision based purely on hope instead of logic. Outside his office window, the roses swayed in the afternoon breeze, and if he didn't know better, he would have sworn they looked pleased. Later that afternoon, as he stood in his garden with soil under his fingernails for the first time in his life, watching Bella laugh at his clumsy attempts to transplant seedlings, Jasper realized he'd never been happier to be completely out of his element. The garden revolution was just beginning, and apparently, so was his. 2 weeks after Bella Martinez had crashed into his life like a beautiful natural disaster, Jasper Blackwood stood in his transformed garden at sunset, dirt under his fingernails and something that felt suspiciously like happiness blooming in his chest. The man who had once conducted board meetings with the precision of a military operation was now debating the emotional needs of petunias with a woman who had somehow convinced him that plants had feelings. The garden looked like it had been redesigned by Mother Nature herself after a few glasses of wine and a burst of creative inspiration. Where once rigid geometric patterns had imposed order with the subtlety of a prison yard, now flowing curves and unexpected bursts of color created a landscape that seemed to dance in the golden evening light. Wildflowers mingled with roses like old friends at a reunion, and climbing vines had transformed sterile trellises into living works of art. But the most shocking transformation wasn't horticultural. It was the man standing knee-deep in flower beds, arguing with a stubborn dahlia while Bella laughed at his attempts to negotiate with uncooperative plant life. "You're overthinking it," she called from across the garden, where she was coaxing a climbing rose into embracing a new trellis with the patience of a diplomat, brokering international peace agreements. Plants respond to confidence, not corporate strategy. "This dahlia clearly didn't get the memo about cooperation," Jasper replied, wrestling with what appeared to be the most independently minded flower in horticultural history. He'd traded his $1,000 suits for jeans and work shirts that now bore the honorable battle scars of serious gardening, and somehow looked more like himself than he had in years. "Stop trying to control it and just guide it," Bella laughed, abandoning her own botanical negotiations to come rescue him from the dahlia's rebellion. She moved through the garden like she was dancing with the landscape itself, every step sure and graceful despite the uneven terrain. When she reached him, she placed her hands over his on the plant's stem, and Jasper forgot all about dahlias, gardens, and possibly his own name. Her touch sent electricity shooting up his arms like he'd grabbed a live wire. But instead of pulling away, he found himself leaning closer, breathing in her scent of sunshine and possibility. "Like this," she murmured, her voice soft enough that he had to lean in to hear her. "Feel how it wants to grow. Don't force it where you think it should go." They worked together in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing as they guided the stubborn plant into cooperation. Jasper realized this was the first time in his adult life that he'd worked on something without a profit margin, a deadline, or a 5-year strategic plan, and the absence of pressure felt like taking off shoes that had been too tight for years. "There," Bella said triumphantly as the dahlia finally settled into its new home. "See? Sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying so hard to make them perfect." She was still standing close enough that he could count the gold flecks in her amber eyes, close enough that if he moved just a few inches forward, he could finally discover if her lips were as soft as they looked. The air between them hummed with the kind of tension that belonged in romance novels and movie climaxes, and for once in his controlled, calculated life, Jasper wanted to stop thinking and just act. "Bella, he began, but was interrupted by the sound of expensive shoes crunching across gravel with the distinctive rhythm of someone who was absolutely not supposed to be there. They sprang apart like teenagers caught by disapproving parents, just as Victoria Hartwell, his ex-fiancée and current symbol of everything he was supposed to want in life, rounded the corner in designer heels that were completely unsuitable for garden exploration. Victoria looked exactly like she had 18 months ago when she'd walked out of his life. Perfectly styled blonde hair that defied both gravity and weather, a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the kind of cold beauty that belonged on magazine covers and corporate boardrooms. She was everything Bella wasn't: polished, predictable, and perfectly matched to his old life. "Hello, Jasper," Victoria said, her voice carrying the subtle chill that had once passed for sophistication in his world. Her eyes swept over his dirt-stained clothes and garden mussed hair with the expression of someone discovering their prized thoroughbred had decided to become a farm horse. "I heard you were gardening now, Victoria." Jasper's voice came out, rougher than intended, like he'd forgotten how to speak to people who existed in his former world. "What are you doing here?" "I came to discuss the Hartwell merger," she replied, though her attention had shifted to Bella, who was standing with her hands on her hips and an expression that suggested she was mentally calculating the physics required to launch someone into orbit using only garden tools. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Bella Martinez," Bella said, extending a dirt-stained hand with the confidence of someone who had never been intimidated by designer clothing or trust fund attitudes. "I'm the gardener who's been teaching your ex-fiancé that life doesn't have to be as rigid as a corporate flowchart." Victoria's smile could have frozen champagne at 50 paces. How quaint. Jasper always did enjoy his little projects. The dismissal in her tone made something dangerous flash in Bella's amber eyes, and Jasper suddenly realized he was about to witness what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, if the unstoppable force had been raised by 3 overprotective brothers, and the immovable object had never met anyone who didn't automatically defer to her trust fund. Project? Bella's laugh had edges sharp enough to cut crystal. "Honey, I'm not sure what fantasy world you're living in, but this isn't a project. This is a man finally learning how to be human instead of a very expensive robot programmed to make money and look good in magazine photos." Victoria's perfectly composed expression developed hairline cracks around the edges. "And you think you're qualified to teach him that? What exactly are your credentials besides manual labor?" "Well," Bella replied cheerfully, settling into what Jasper was beginning to recognize as her about to destroy someone with pure truth stance, "I'm qualified because I see him as a person instead of a portfolio. I'm qualified because I make him laugh instead of just making him look successful. And I'm qualified because when he's with me, he stops trying to be perfect and starts trying to be happy." The words hung in the garden air like a challenge, and Jasper realized that Bella had just articulated something he hadn't been able to put into words himself. Victoria represented his old life, beautiful, successful, and ultimately empty. Bella represented possibility, growth, and the terrifying prospect of actually being known by another person. "Jasper," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of authority she'd learned in boardrooms and country clubs. "Surely you realize this is just a phase, a rebellion against the pressure of your position. We could be good together again, once you're done playing in the dirt." For a moment, Jasper felt the pull of his old life, the comfort of predictability, the safety of meeting expectations, the ease of relationships that never demanded vulnerability. Victoria was offering him everything he'd thought he wanted: success, status, and a life free from the messy complications of genuine emotion. Then he looked at Bella, standing in his transformed garden with soil under her fingernails and hope in her eyes, and realized that she wasn't offering him what he thought he wanted. She was offering him what he actually needed. "You're right," he said quietly, and Victoria's smile began to bloom with premature victory. "This is a rebellion against pressure and expectations." He stepped closer to Bella, close enough to take her dirt-stained hand in his. "But it's not a phase, Victoria. It's a choice. And I choose growth over perfection, laughter over success. And ... He looked down at Bella, whose amber eyes were wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "And I choose her." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "You're making a mistake, Jasper. She's not from our world. She never fit into your life." "You're right," Bella said, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening around them. "I don't fit into his old life. But maybe he doesn't want his old life anymore." Jasper realized that somewhere between learning to talk to roses and discovering that happiness didn't require a business plan, he had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with the woman who'd taught him that the best things in life grew wild and free. "She's right," he said, his voice carrying a certainty he'd never felt about anything in his carefully planned existence. "I don't want my old life anymore." As Victoria retreated across the gravel with as much dignity as someone could muster while wearing inappropriate shoes for garden visits, Jasper turned to face Bella, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free and throw itself at her feet. "So," he said, suddenly nervous despite having just made the biggest decision of his life, "I just chose you over my ex-fiancée and probably half my social circle. Any thoughts on that?" Bella's smile could have powered the entire Hudson Valley. "I think," she said, stepping closer until they were breathing the same air, "that you're finally learning how to bloom." And then, surrounded by the garden they'd created together and the future they were brave enough to choose, Jasper Blackwood finally stopped thinking and started living, beginning with a kiss that tasted like possibility and felt like coming home. 6 months later, the Blackwood estate had become something that would have given Jasper's former self a mild coronary and his current self a reason to wake up smiling every morning. The perfectly manicured grounds that had once looked like a magazine spread designed by someone with serious control issues now resembled a living fairy tale, where chaos and beauty had learned to waltz together in perfect harmony. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows of the manor house, illuminating what could only be described as the most beautiful disaster in culinary history. Bella Martinez, soon-to-be Blackwood, stood at the marble counter wearing one of Jasper's dress shirts over paint-splattered leggings, her wild curls barely contained by a scrunchie that had seen better decades, attempting to create what she optimistically called breakfast and what any reasonable person would classify as abstract art involving eggs. "I think the pancakes are trying to communicate with us," she announced cheerfully, poking at a formation that looked suspiciously like it might achieve sentience at any moment. "Either that, or they're planning an escape route." Jasper looked up from his laptop, where he was conducting his morning video conference with investors, while sitting at his kitchen table in jeans and a t-shirt that declared him "World's Okayest Gardener," a gift from Bella that he wore with more pride than any of his previous designer suits. His hair was adorably mussed from sleep and gardening, and he had the kind of relaxed happiness that came from finally figuring out who he actually was underneath all those years of expectations. "Gentlemen," he said to his computer screen with the authority of someone who'd learned that true power came from authenticity rather than intimidation, "I'll need to continue this call later. My fiancée is creating breakfast, and past experience suggests supervision might prevent a visit." From the fire department, the investors who had initially been horrified by Jasper's transformation from corporate shark to happy human being gradually learned that a CEO who actually enjoyed his life made better decisions than one who treated existence like a hostile takeover. Blackwood Industries had been more profitable in the past 6 months than in the previous 2 years combined. "Did you just call pancakes a fire hazard?" Bella asked, brandishing a spatula with the confidence of someone who'd never met a kitchen challenge she couldn't eventually defeat through sheer determination and creative problem-solving. "I called your relationship with kitchen appliances adventurous," Jasper replied diplomatically, closing his laptop and moving to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Even after 6 months, touching her still felt like discovering electricity all over again. "Besides, I happen to love your adventurous cooking. It keeps life interesting." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying my scrambled eggs once achieved escape velocity." Bella laughed, leaning back against his chest with the easy intimacy of someone who'd found her perfect fit in the most unexpected package. Their morning domestic chaos was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Whitmore, who entered the kitchen, carrying a silver tray and wearing an expression of long-suffering affection that had become her default setting since Bella had turned the household upside down in the best possible way. "The wedding planner is here," she announced, setting down a tea service that probably cost more than most people's cars, but which Bella used to make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "She's in the garden office, trying very hard not to have a nervous breakdown about the unconventional venue choices." Jasper and Bella exchanged grins that contained enough mischief to power a small revolution. Their wedding planning had become legendary among Manhattan's event coordination community, primarily because the bride and groom kept insisting on decisions that made traditional planners question their life choices. "Let me guess," Jasper said, stealing a piece of perfectly imperfect bacon from Bella's breakfast creation. "She's still struggling with our request to hold the ceremony in the wildflower meadow instead of the formal rose garden, and the reception in the greenhouse instead of the ballroom," Bella added, successfully flipping a pancake that looked like abstract art but smelled like heaven. Apparently, asking guests to sit on hay bales covered with vintage quilts instead of gold Chiavari chairs is rustic to the point of scandal. Mrs. Whitmore's smile could have powered the entire estate. In 30 years of working for the Blackwood family, she'd never seen the house feel like an actual home instead of a beautiful museum where people happened to sleep. "I told her that if she couldn't handle a wedding that prioritized joy over photograph opportunities, perhaps she wasn't the right fit for this particular celebration." "I love you, Mrs. Whitmore," Bella declared, abandoning her pancake duties to give the older woman a hug. That would have horrified the previous generation of estate staff, but which Mrs. Whitmore had learned to treasure. "Have I mentioned lately that you're the best surrogate mother-in-law a girl could ask for?" "Only every day, dear," Mrs. Whitmore replied, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "And I love you too, even if you did teach my employer that it's acceptable to conduct business meetings while wearing gardening gloves." Their domestic bliss was interrupted by the sound of expensive car doors slamming in the driveway, followed by voices that carried the unmistakable authority of people who expected the world to rearrange itself around their convenience. "That'll be my parents," Jasper said, his relaxed posture tightening slightly. right on schedule for their monthly concerned About Your Life Choices visit. Bella squeezed his hand, her touch instantly grounding him. Over the past 6 months, she'd become expert at helping him navigate the complicated relationship with parents who loved him but struggled to understand that success could be measured in happiness rather than stock portfolios. "Remember," she said softly, "we're not asking for their permission to be happy. We're just sharing our happiness with them." 5 minutes later, Charles and Eleanor Blackwood swept into the kitchen like visiting royalty, inspecting a particularly puzzling foreign country. Charles wore his usual uniform of perfectly pressed suit and skeptical expression, while Eleanor had clearly dressed for what she considered a safari into her son's inexplicable new life practical shoes, understated jewelry, and the expression of someone prepared to encounter exotic wildlife at any moment. "Jasper," Charles said, embracing his son with the careful affection of someone who'd learned emotional expression through executive training seminars. "You look healthy." "He looks happy, Charles," Eleanor corrected, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure whether happiness was a positive development or a concerning symptom. "Hello, Bella dear. How are the wedding preparations progressing?" Like a beautiful disaster that's somehow turning into the perfect celebration, Bella replied honestly, offering them coffee in mismatched mugs that would have given their country club friends heart palpitations. "We're having the ceremony in the wildflower meadow, the reception in the greenhouse, and your son insisted on writing his own vows despite having never written anything more romantic than a merger agreement. I'll have you know my merger agreements are extremely romantic," Jasper protested, "if you understand the subtle poetry of hostile takeover language." Charles made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Despite his concerns about his son's dramatic life changes, he'd grudgingly admitted that Jasper seemed more genuinely confident than he'd ever been during his years of corporate conquest. "And your business?" Eleanor asked, settling onto a kitchen stool with the cautious air of someone entering uncharted territory. "We heard you've been delegating more responsibilities." "I've been focusing on what actually matters," Jasper replied, his arm finding its way around Bella's waist with the automatic ease of long practice. "Turns out, when you stop trying to control every detail of every project, your team gets more creative and productive. Who knew?" "Besides," Bella added, grinning at his parents with the fearless charm that had conquered their son and gradually worn down their resistance, "someone has to keep him from turning our garden into a corporate flowchart. Yesterday, I caught him trying to create a 5-year strategic plan for the morning glories. They were growing in an inefficient pattern." Jasper protested, though his smile suggested he was aware of the absurdity. Eleanor Blackwood, who had spent 35 years trying to understand her intense, driven son, found herself watching this playful version of him with something approaching wonder. "You seem lighter," she said quietly. "I am," Jasper replied simply. "I spent so many years trying to be the perfect son, the perfect businessman, the perfect everything, that I forgot to figure out who I actually was." Bella didn't just teach me how to garden, she taught me how to grow. The conversation was interrupted by Marcus appearing in the doorway, tablet conspicuously absent for once. Over the past 6 months, he'd transformed from stressed executive assistant to something resembling Jasper's younger brother, complete with the right to make sarcastic comments about his boss's romantic life. "The wedding photographer is here," he announced, "and she's absolutely enchanted by the idea of taking engagement photos in a vegetable garden. Apparently, couple surrounded by tomato plants is her new artistic vision." "See?" Bella said triumphantly. To Jasper's parents, "Even the vendors are learning to embrace beautiful chaos." An hour later, the entire group stood in the transformed gardens, watching Jasper and Bella pose among the thriving vegetables and wildflowers they'd planted together. The photographer, initially skeptical about the unconventional location, was now practically vibrating with artistic excitement as she captured images of a love story that had grown as naturally and beautifully as the garden surrounding it. Charles Blackwood found himself standing next to Mrs. Whitmore, both of them watching their respective charges with expressions of bemused affection. "I have to admit," he said quietly, "I've never seen him this happy." "He's found his person," Mrs. Whitmore replied simply. "Someone who loves him for who he is, not who he might become or what he can provide. It makes all the difference." In the garden, Bella was laughing at something Jasper had whispered in her ear, her joy so infectious that even the photographer was grinning behind her camera. The roses they'd saved together bloomed in wild profusion around them, no longer perfect, but utterly alive, just like the love story they'd grown from the ground up. As the sun set over the estate, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that rivaled any of Bella's chaotic breakfast creations, Jasper pulled her close and marveled at how completely his life had changed. A year ago, he'd been successful, wealthy, and profoundly lonely. Now he was successful, wealthy, and so happy it sometimes scared him. "No regrets?" Bella asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. "Only one," Jasper replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I regret not posting that gardening job sooner." 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day when the leaves matched Bella's wild curls and the air smelled like apple cider and possibility, they were married in the wildflower meadow, surrounded by everyone who'd learned to love their beautiful, chaotic, perfectly imperfect life. Mrs. Whitmore cried happy tears. Marcus gave a best man speech that reduced half the guests to laughter and the other half to tears. And even Charles and Eleanor Blackwood admitted that perhaps happiness was a better measure of success than stock prices. And in the garden they'd created together, wild, free, and blooming with the kind of beauty that came from being loved exactly as they were, Jasper and Bella began the greatest adventure of all, a lifetime of growing together, one perfectly imperfect day at a time. The billionaire had found his treasure, the gardener had found her home, and love had found a way to bloom exactly where it was planted, in soil rich with laughter, watered with joy, and tended with the kind of care that turned ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. Some fairy tales end with happily ever after. This one ended with happily ever after, covered in dirt, and absolutely perfect. Fiend.